Good afternoon, First Presbyterian Church family. I hope this finds you well on Thursday, February 10th. In this month of February, we're going to be looking to matters of the heart. And last week, I talked about brokenness, a time you may have been broken in your life, and how Jesus Christ can meet you at that place of brokenness. This Thursday, I want to look at love. After all, Monday is Valentine's Day. 1 Corinthians 13 we associate often with at this time of year, the great love chapter from the New Testament. I want to share a story that is framed around 1 Corinthians 13. I've shared part of it before in sermons, and I will probably share it again. Nay Bailey worked with a parachurch organization for many years, and she was approached about doing this, but a series of talks that she gave was put into a book called Faith is Not a Feeling. And in one chapter, she speaks about her relationship with her father. Now, as she speaks, the father always provided for the family. He was a lawyer and did well, and materially she had a good life. But they were not that emotionally close. It seemed to be difficult for him to get close. And she basically ignored him. She was always polite, but it was basically, you do your thing and I'll do my thing. Her younger siblings did not seem to have that issue. She was the firstborn. They just seemed to be at odds. She writes, I thought of how little communication we had and how he seemed to be able only to express his love for me by giving material things. I didn't feel his love and wondered if it really existed. I was waiting all those years for him to love me in the way that I wanted to be loved. He never did. And so my hate and resentment grew. And then I heard the message on God's love. If God is love and 1 Corinthians 13 describes God's love, then it meant that God's love toward my dad is kind. God's love toward my dad is patient. God's love toward my dad is not provoked. God's love toward my dad does not take into account wrongs suffered. God's love toward my dad would bear all things, believe all things, hope all things, endure all things. God's love toward my dad would never fail. I thought, if God loves my father just the way he is, who am I not to love him also? My love had been conditional, based on his performance. I had been waiting for him to change, and then if he changed, then I would begin to love him. My love had said, Daddy, I'll love you if you do this and if you do that, and yet God's love simply said, I love you, period. No ifs about it. It was as though God was saying to me, I love you just the way you are. I love him just the way he is. I want you to love him just the way he is. She began to reflect on her father's childhood. He was raised only child in a small town north of Shreveport, Louisiana. His parents had marital difficulties and separated and divorced. His mother died when he was 13 years old. He went to live with an aunt and uncle. His father, a wildcatter, dabbling in oil and investments, making and losing tens of thousands of dollars. And so he would come in periodically, shower when the times were good, shower the son with gifts, maybe a trip, spend a lot of money, and then be off again. That was how his father learned to express any kind of affection. Her mother, on the other hand, had grown up the youngest of four, working a family farm almost at the panhandle of Oklahoma. And it was a family that was very verbally expressive and, pat you, I love you, and all that kind of mess. They were very particular. And so her mother showed her love, demonstrated it a lot. As a child, she thought, she must love me and he must not. That's what she thought. The new words gave her understanding, And she said she was coming up on a visit. I was grateful for this new understanding as I pulled the car into my driveway. It seemed as if the Lord had done something new in my life, but I knew the real test was yet to come. 2 months later, I flew to Louisiana for vacation, still filled with an attitude of love and acceptance for my dad. I found I was free from judging him, criticizing him, or expressing disapproval, either verbally or non-verbally. I remember one day in particular, we were sitting in the living room together. I was on the couch and Daddy was in his reclining chair in front of the TV, and soon he fell asleep. I looked over him in his chair for a long time and said in a soft whisper, "Daddy, I love you and accept you just like you are sitting there in the chair." And gradually, the relationship began to improve. She found him doing some sensitive things for her. She had a short outpatient procedure, and he went with her, took her to the doctor, took her home, waited for her, bought the prescribed medicine at the nearby pharmacy. There was a dress shop near his law office. He brought home 3 dresses on approval for me to choose which ones I would like to keep. So bit by bit began to be restored. She also here talks about she already had a good relationship with her mother, but doing some things for her mother and her father, some little gifts that she would get for them. So this has been now going on for some time. She had come to a point, she said, sometime later I had to make a major career decision. The thought came to me, would I be willing to go to my father and seek his advice? I also wanted to ask his forgiveness for some of my actions and bad attitudes of the years gone by. We had never talked much about personal things, so it was a bit scary for me. One Sunday afternoon when I was visiting my family, Daddy and I were at home alone watching a football game together. I mustered up all the courage I could, and then I asked him for counsel on my career decision. He was extremely helpful, and it went much easier than I expected. And then I said, Daddy, there's something I've been thinking about. I've harbored a lot of bad attitudes when I was growing up, attitudes of ungratefulness and lack of love. I realized how wrong I was, and I'd like to ask you to forgive me. Will you forgive me? He turned in his great overstuffed reclining chair and looked at me with a slight twinkle in his eyes. No, he paused. I don't remember all those things, except for the time. And he named an instance and laughed. I thought a moment and said, well, will you forgive me for the things you can remember? Yes, he answered, and the ball game continued. I discussed with him an invitation to accompany a gentleman with a tour group. This gentleman was leading a tour group on his first guided tour to Israel. And what did he think? My father replied in Archie Bunker fashion, I wouldn't give you a nickel for the Wailing Wall, but if you want to go, it's okay with me. Then I said, Daddy, I'll drive back to Dallas and listen to the rest of the game on the radio. Fine, he said, that's a good idea. You'll beat some of the traffic. We got up out of our chairs. Now, where are you going on your next trip? He had never asked me that before. Houston, Nacogdoches, I replied. Again, she was based in her work. She was based out of Dallas and did some traveling. And then he said, well, why don't you warm up one of those cheeseburgers from last night and eat it on the way back? She writes, I wasn't sure how hungry I was for leftover cheeseburger, but I wasn't about to turn it down. Good idea, I said. I gathered my things together to leave. At the door, Daddy handed me the cheeseburger and asked, when will you be home next? He never asked me that before either. Oh, on about the 21st or 22nd. Smiling, he said, I'll see you on the 21st. A couple of days later, I talked to my mother on the phone. Did Daddy see anything about our visit? I asked. Yes, he said. Nay must be losing her mind. She asked me for some advice. The relationship was healed. Maybe not perfect, but so much had happened between them and positive. It is funny as she shares some of the other things that were good things that were done and to heal that. God's love toward your loved one, your colleague, is kind, is patient, is not provoked. God's love toward your loved one does not take into account wrongs suffered. God's love toward your loved one would bear all things, believe all things, hope all things, endure all things. God's love towards your loved one would never fail. It's a good reminder. I go back to this perspective. It's part of the cover of the newsletter for February. It's something to keep in mind at this time of year. And maybe there's somebody in your circle that you maybe need to re-examine your thoughts, feelings towards that individual. Or maybe you need to hear those words about yourself. Think about it. Have a good week.